December 7th, 1941. The assassin's blade, its bones, forged from American scrap iron. Its nerves, sparked by American technology. The torpedoes Japan used to cripple the U.S. fleet were built with American materials and born from American ingenuity. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is the historical truth. Let's turn the clock back to 1930 to trace the threads of history. Forged by the fires of the Meiji Restoration, a new power was rising in the East. Japan's wealth was built on conquest. Through the Sino-Japanese War, the Russo-Japanese War, and World War I. From the Qing dynasty, it plundered silver. From Korea, it extracted minerals. From Taiwan, it harvested grain. By 1930, its vaults were overflowing with the spoils of war. At home, they enforced free compulsory education, achieving a literacy rate of nearly 99%. They raised a generation of skilled workers and fanatical soldiers. From the global perspective of 1930, Japan was a regional middle power bound by geopolitical chains. At the top, America and Germany held the keys to advanced technology. Britain and France monopolized the world's colonial resources. These were the elite industrial powers. But Japan barely scraped into the quasi-industrial tier, lacking resources, lagging in technology, and limited in production. First, resources. Oil reserves stood at about 300 million barrels, with an annual production of just 3 million barrels. This was only enough to keep a million-ton fleet patrolling for 6 months, or fighting for 1 month. Coal reserves stood at approximately 7 billion tons, and iron ore reserves at about 100 million tons. Beyond that, reserves were scarce. 1.2 million tons of copper, 5,000 tons of tin, and merely 500 tons of tungsten. Reserves of aluminum, nickel, and rubber were zero. However, that 100 million tons of iron ore was low grade, filled with impurities like sulfur and phosphorus. It could only produce low toughness, ordinary steel. Because of its brittleness, it was limited to manufacturing rifles, machine guns, 75mm guns, and ship hulls. 200mm plus heavy cannon barrels, high-strength bomb casings, and torpedo air chambers. The high-toughness alloy steel required for these weapons could not be produced domestically. Japan was forced to rely entirely on imports. Second, technology. It was stuck in the steam age. In power, it lacked piston technology for internal combustion engines, unable to build engines for monoplanes, heavy trucks, or tanks. In manufacturing, it lacked gear hoppers for battleship turbines and catalytic cracking for aviation fuel. In control, it lacked precision machining for torpedo gyroscopes. Finally, production. With no electrification or assembly lines, it relied on hand craftsmanship. Annual output in 1930 was 50,000 rifles, 1,500 machine guns, 200 artillery pieces, and fewer than 10 experimental tanks. It produced only 400 handmade cars and 400 obsolete biplanes. Building a single 30,000-ton battleship took 4 years. In summary, 1930s Japan was a quasi-industrial power. Restricted by resources, technology, and capacity, it was destined to be a global middle power, but the hegemon of East Asia. But the Yamato ambition was boundless. It dreamed of rivaling America and Britain. It set its sights on the last uncolonized prize, the vast and resource-rich China. The plan? Import massive resources, expand capacity, stockpile weapons, and swallow the elephant in a quick war. Japan saw itself as a player on the grand chessboard, but the US and UK, guardians of the Washington system, were the rule makers. They would not allow Japan to swallow China alone. They tacitly restricted Japan's imports of scrap iron, essentially high-grade ore, and banned the transfer of advanced military technology and assembly lines. Japan's ambition seemed destined to remain just a fantasy on paper, until late 1929, when the Great Depression struck. The American economy collapsed. $30 billion, one-third of America's GDP, evaporated overnight. Liquidity dried up. 9,000 banks collapsed, taking the nation's credit with them. Overcapacity exploded. Steel production plunged 76%. Auto production crashed 75%. The factories were full, but the order books were empty. The result was brutal. 1 in 4 Americans jobless, wages slashed by 42%. Americans were starving. At this very moment, the Japanese arrived, with gold and silver in hand. Capitalists may have a nationality, but capital has no borders. To feed the people, America threw open its doors. They sold them advanced mother machines to grind precision gears. They shipped scrap iron and copper to cast heavy artillery, shells, and torpedoes. They pumped oil to fuel the fleet's operations. America didn't just sell goods. It sold the blueprints of war. Ford and GM taught them mass production. E.W. Bliss licensed the torpedo gyroscope technology. And Universal Oil Products gave them the key to high-octane aviation fuel. Throughout the 1930s, Japan imported 30 million barrels of oil, 2 million tons of scrap iron, and 100,000 tons of copper annually, along with 12,000 military trucks and critical military technologies, all from the United States. From resources to technology, from technology to assembly lines, America was the teacher that guided Japan from a quasi-industrial power to an industrial power. In return, Japan paid a tuition of approximately 620 tons of gold over the decade. By 1941, Japan had used imported American scrap iron and technology to build the most powerful war machine in Asia. In the air and at sea, the combined fleet boasted 10 aircraft carriers. The core was the Kido Butai 6 heavy fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, supported by 4 light carriers: Ryujo, Hosho, Zueho, and Taiyo. Their heavy carriers deployed 60 to 80 aircraft each, while light carriers carried 20 to 30. The air wing included the Zero fighter, the K torpedo bomber armed with the Type 91 torpedo, and the Val dive bomber carrying 250 kilogram bombs. Alongside the carriers stood 11 active battleships, the secret super battleship Yamato, along with the Nagato, Kongo, Fuso, and Issei class. Flanking them were 38 heavy and light cruisers, 112 destroyers, and 65 submarines. Meanwhile, in Hawaii, the U.S. Pacific Fleet had only 3 heavy carriers: Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, averaging 70 to 80 aircraft. The F-4F Wildcat, SBD Dauntless, and TBD Devastator, and 9 battleships, the Colorado, Tennessee, Pennsylvania, and Nevada class, plus 21 heavy and light cruisers, 50 destroyers, and 33 submarines. The tonnage ratio in the Pacific, 1.2 million tons versus 900,000 tons. On land, the Imperial headquarters commanded over 1 million troops, equipped with advanced weaponry ranging from heavy machine guns to tanks. For details, please watch Episode 1. Since 1895, the fleet controlled the seas. The Army conquered the land, indoctrinating militarism at home, colonizing and plundering abroad. War feeding war. Expansion without limit. This was Japan's path to power. But in 1941, this path to power hit a serious snag. Since the China incident in 1937, Japan failed to secure a quick victory. Instead, its million-man army was dragged into a 4-year war of attrition with Chinese forces. The consumption was shocking. In wartime, Japan annually needed to import 35 million barrels of oil, 2.5 million tons of scrap iron, and 110,000 tons of copper, mostly from the US, plus 15,000 tons of tin, 2 million tons of rice, and 50,000 tons of rubber, mostly from Southeast Asia. As they sank deeper into the Chinese quagmire, imports and plunder could no longer fill the void. By late 1941, Japan's gold reserves dropped below 40 tons. Oil reserves fell to less than 18 months. Meanwhile, their Axis ally, Germany, had conquered Western Europe, besieged Britain, and was lunging at the Soviet Union. The European colonies left behind in Southeast Asia, Malaya, Indonesia, and Vietnam were overflowing with 65 million barrels of oil, 100,000 tons of tin, and over 1 million tons of rubber. For Japan, the only way to solve this dilemma was to start a new cycle of war feeding war. The first target, French Vietnam, rice and rubber. In July 1941, the Japanese army marched south from its base in Hanoi, while the combined fleet steamed into Cam Ranh Bay. In just 7 days, Japan forced the Vichy French government at the point of a katana to sign a pact. Japan took total control of Vietnam's economy, politics, and military. Immediately, they stockpiled troops, built airfields, and expanded ports. Their bombers could now cover British Malaya. Their fleet could strike the entire Dutch East Indies. Oil and minerals were within grasp. Once Southeast Asia was secured, infinite resources would flow into the China War. Japan would swallow East Asia whole and become a global superpower. However, this triggered a fierce backlash from Washington. The Pacific could tolerate American allies, but never a rival superpower. On July 26, 1941, America announced the freezing of all Japanese assets. Days later, it halted all exports. Oil, metals, technology, everything. The industrial teacher wanted to force the student to kneel through a starvation strategy. America joined Britain, the Netherlands, and China to form the ABCD encirclement, a near-total global embargo. Without imports, Japan's oil would last only 18 months. Stocks of steel, rubber, and food would be exhausted within 24 months. After that, the war machine stops. It meant losing the war in China, followed by the loss of Manchuria, Korea, and Taiwan. It meant losing 80% of its territory, 1.4 million square kilometers, losing 50% of its population, 73 million people, losing critical resources and strategic footholds, and a direct economic loss of 8.5 billion yen, about 1,700 tons of gold. 50 years of blood and treasure turned to ash. Japan would fall from the hegemon of East Asia to a third-rate nation. This was a humiliation the Yamato people could not accept. As the proverb goes, "A cornered rat will bite the cat." Moreover, Japan still possessed the 1.2 million ton combined fleet in the Pacific. It would clear all obstacles to seize the oil and minerals of the South. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked without declaring war, leading to the scene that started this film, the attack on Pearl Harbor. A surprise attack on an unsuspecting fleet. 2,403 Americans lay dead. 188 aircraft destroyed. 8 battleships sunk or damaged. The Arizona exploded. The Oklahoma capsized. Of the capital ships, only the 3 aircraft carriers survived. The fleet lost 230,000 tons. Using American resources and technology, Japan had stolen command of the sea. The students struck a cowardly blow to hurt and intimidate the master. But American will was harder than steel. Anger turned into cold, hard action. President Roosevelt declared war.
We will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.
They rounded up 120,000 Japanese Americans into internment camps. They initiated a massive draft of millions. They converted every available factory into a weapon maker. They appointed commanders to lead the counterattack. Americans prepared to teach that treacherous student a brutal lesson. Starting in 1942, the U.S. and Japan engaged in a series of decisive battles across the vast Pacific. May 1942. The Battle of the Coral Sea. Japan's MO Operation Force against U.S. Task Force 17. The battle lasted 5 days. Japan lost 1 light carrier, 92 aircraft, 1 destroyer, and 966 men, including 90 aircrew. The U.S. lost 1 fleet carrier, 69 aircraft, 1 destroyer, and 656 men, including 35 aircrew. The U.S. successfully delayed the Japanese advance on Port Moresby. June 1942. The Battle of Midway. Japan's first air fleet against U.S. Task Force 17. The battle lasted 3 days. Japan lost 4 carriers, 248 aircraft, 1 cruiser, and 3,057 men, including 110 elite pilots. The U.S. lost 1 carrier, 150 aircraft, 1 destroyer, and 307 men, including 172 pilots. Japan failed to capture Midway. August 1942. Battle of Savo Island. Japan's 8th Fleet against U.S. Task Force 62. The battle lasted 90 minutes. Japan lost 58 men. The U.S. lost 3 heavy cruisers and 1,077 men. Japan won the battle, but failed to stop the U.S. landings. August 1942. Battle of the Eastern Solomons. Japan's 3rd Fleet against U.S. Task Force 61. The battle lasted 2 days. Japan lost 1 light carrier, 75 aircraft, 1 destroyer, and 290 men, including 61 elite aircrew. The U.S. lost 25 aircraft and 90 men, including 7 aircrew. The U.S. successfully delayed Japan's reinforcement of Guadalcanal. October 1942, Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. Japan's 3rd Fleet against U.S. Task Force 61. The battle lasted 3 days. Japan lost 99 aircraft and 500 men, including 148 elite aircrew. The U.S. lost 1 fleet carrier, 81 aircraft, 1 destroyer, and 260 men, including 30 aircrew. Japan won a tactical victory, but had no replacements. November 1942. The Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. Japan's 2nd Fleet against U.S. Task Force 64. The battle lasted 3 days. Japan lost 40 aircraft, 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, and 3 destroyers, plus 1,900 men, including 35 elite aircrew. The U.S. lost 20 aircraft, 2 destroyers, and 1,700 men, including 12 aircrew. Japan completely lost the strategic initiative. After the brutal attrition of 1942, both sides were heavily damaged and desperate for reinforcements. A year-long strategic stalemate followed. Both industrial machines were running at full speed. But by the end of 1943, the gap was undeniable. Plagued by resource shortages, Japan added only 2 cruisers, 15 destroyers, 0 major warships, and 3,000 aircraft. In contrast, the U.S. Pacific Fleet alone received an entire armada, 7 fleet carriers, 9 light carriers, 2 battleships, 12 cruisers, 85 destroyers, and over 12,000 advanced aircraft. Looking ahead to 1944, the projected gap was even more terrifying.
No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
And then, the vengeance for Pearl Harbor arrived. In 1944, over the Philippine Sea, 15 carriers launched 900 planes, using radar and VT fuses. With a 20-to-1 kill ratio, they slaughtered 600 Zeros, sinking 3 carriers, including the Pearl Harbor fugitive Shokaku. At Leyte Gulf, America unleashed 240 ships and 1,500 aircraft, totaling 1.5 million tons. Using advanced radar and air supremacy, they hunted down the last Pearl Harbor fugitive, the Zuikaku, sank the Yamato's sister ship, Musashi, sinking over 300,000 tons in total, basically destroying the combined fleet. In 1945, 400 American planes swarmed the Yamato. With the explosion of 10 torpedoes and 7 bombs, they destroyed the spiritual totem of the Yamato race, the Yamato. The Americans had completed their revenge for Pearl Harbor. History repeats itself with startling precision. All they that take the sword shall perish with the sword. The ultimate irony of this war: the very swords Japan brandished were forged from American steel and American technology. America once believed they were merely cultivating a lucrative Asian business partner, but the abacus of capital could never leash the swelling ambition of an empire. They sought to sever geopolitical chains with pure violence, dreaming of global supremacy. But violence is a sword without a hilt. It inevitably consumes those who wield it. In the ledger of war, every account must be settled. When the smoke finally cleared over the ruins of Tokyo, a former Japanese bureaucrat, Nobusuke Kishi, stood silently, gazing at the shattered rubble. The gears of history turned once more. Japan repeated exactly what it did in 1930, bowed its head, learned from America once more, and attempted to rise again. Geopolitics and violence, resources and development, peace and submission. History spirals ever forward, woven through the inevitable and the accidental.